Welcome everybody and ting and ting and ting. All right. Now we already watched part one of why did Britain abolish slavery in 1833, and so we're going to watch the second part. Now this part is like 52 minutes long, so I'm going to break it up into two parts. Okay. So without any further ado, let's go ahead and YouTube and simmer and see the remaining two parts of why Britain abolished the slave trade.
In part one of this documentary series, we explored the rebirth of an anti-slavery movement in Britain in the 1820s, an organisation set up to bring about an end to the institution of slavery across the British Empire. Yet they knew from the outset how difficult a task it would be to emancipate the enslaved populations. To do this, they would have to lobby for an abolition bill in Parliament and secure a majority of votes in both houses for any legislation. The trouble with this was the fact that Parliament remained a hotbed of conservative members of the West India interest, men who supported the institution of slavery and held vested interests in upholding it. In many ways, abolitionists faced a near impossible task. They had to convince well-connected and powerful MPs, many of whom owned property in the West Indies and indeed slaves, to terminate the very foundation of their fortunes.
Okay, now when you take a look at the structure of politics, it seems like back then the people who own everything were the politicians. You know what I mean? They own stake in the Caribbean, they own stake here. So then, whose interests are they're gonna look after? Certainly not the poor people within that society. They're gonna look after their own interests, and certainly not the people of who they're gonna enslave or who they had enslaved. But then there's a parallel. It's only slightly different here now. Okay, rich people still control the government, but the way they do it here is campaign donations. So they donate to them and say, well, you know, in the little backroom sections and thing, they say, hey, do this for us. Make sure you do this to make our businesses grow by bringing back regulations on things like, you know, what you put in the food, so that we could pump up mass production and put anything we want in the food and feed the people. You know, that just as an example. You understand what I mean? So then what's happening is still they wielding the power and they sending in lobbyists, and a lot of the times the lobbyists sit in on legislations that are passed to give their opinion, because you know they're supposed to be the intellects of society just because they have money. But it's all a money grab type vibe. You understand what I'm saying? All those rich people in Parliament who own all the lands and stuff in the West Indies, they're wielding their power in it to keep their money rolling in, regardless to its effects on anybody, not just slaves or anybody. Because, like I said, the common people there probably are being used for certain things at home to keep the vibe, you know, to keep the machinery rolling.
It would take some time, but in 1833, Britain would abolish slavery in its dominions. But how was the seemingly impossible achieved? And what events led up to one of the most significant pieces of legislation in British history? In the early 19th century, soon after Britain had abolished the slave trade, the nation's appetite for slave-grown commodities, such as sugar, showed no real signs of diminishing. All social classes were now consuming sugar frequently. It was this commerce, the trade in sugar, that had benefited so many in the metropole and financed the British Treasury in the form of taxation and import duties. It funded industrialisation, numerous commercial projects, and provided the capital for investment. West Indian proprietors continued to increase the scale of their production and exports to Britain. It was evident that the Abolition Act of 1807, which had outlawed the slave trade, had not hindered their ability to do this. In fact, overall production of sugar from the British West Indies rose considerably after the Napoleonic Wars. Unfortunately for planters, however, this sheer scale of production, at least by the 1820s and early 1830s, was beginning to exceed Britain's demand. Proprietors in the West Indies continued to increase production in this period, not because demand was continuing to grow exponentially, but because the price of sugar had fallen dramatically. According to one planter, the price of sugar had fallen from £3 per hundredweight in 1814 to 22 shillings per hundredweight in 1831.
Wow.
This dramatic fall in price was forcing planters to try and achieve economies of scale by increasing production to the extent at which they could still maintain the levels of profit they had enjoyed in the early 19th century. You see, at this point, many planters, as entrepreneurial as they may have considered themselves, were not at all attuned with the founding principles of microeconomics. Judging by the emancipation debates of the 1830s, proprietors were well aware that due to an excess supply of the commodity, a sugar glut now existed in the colonies. But this did not stop them from continuing to increase exportation. In tune with the natural laws of supply and demand, by exporting excess sugar back to Britain, they were themselves causing the price of the commodity to fall even further. The lower the price, the more they exported. And so, a vicious cycle developed. Those in the West India interest were either blind to or simply in denial of this fact. In their eyes, it was the increased competition from abroad that was to blame for the lowering of sugar prices and their dwindling economic prosperity.
See, they're doing what becomes natural to the human condition, Oh, this is bad because of this, you know what I mean? It's like they're saying the prices of oil is high, of gas is high because of the president, and they're not taking into consideration. And I'm talking about here. I'm talking about right here, okay? A lot of the times when I say something, I'm looking at it from where I am. Comment down below if it's different where you're from. That way we could learn from each other and we could figure out what's going on for ourselves instead of depending on them. But anyway, and depending on people who doesn't have our best interest at heart. That's when I say them. That's who I mean. But yes, it's see, I don't lost my train of thought because I had to explain something there. But it's kind of funny how, from what I'm seeing here, where this is going, they sort of facilitated their own demise by not understanding microeconomics. You know what I mean, and thing. So this is quite interesting, the direction this is going. Let's keep watching it.
Prosperity. Newly established crown colonies such as British Guyana, alongside foreign colonies such as Cuba and Brazil, both of which still had access to the slave trade, achieved lower production costs and undercut the price of West Indian sugar within the European market. This well-acknowledged fact infuriated planters and pro-slavery MPs even more so, with talks of emancipation looming. It would be grossly hypocritical, they claimed, for those who promoted free trade to wish for emancipation while simultaneously purchasing cheaper slave-grown sugar. But this was an era in which ideas of free trade were overtaking the old established system of monopolistic privilege. Arguably encouraging the West Indian planters to overproduce was the exclusive monopoly they had on the British sugar market.
See, I mean, like again, you could equate it because we're going back into a monopolistic type of existence with corporations here again, where we are. Like one corporation will buy a whole bunch of others and create a monopoly. And there's no real competition, so then they do whatever they want. I mean, one grocery store now is trying to buy up another chain of grocery stores. And then what comes from that is union busting, because once they buy them up, they rebrand, redo the whole infrastructure of the company, which squeezes out the unions. It's crazy. And it's happening right now. I mean, as I'm sitting here, it's happening.
Sugar producers from the West Indies continue to be protected in the home market by a differential duty against foreign producers. This monopolistic privilege was now not only damaging the Caribbean colonies, it was no longer working for the British consumer. Questions over the value of the West Indian colonies were beginning to be raised as early as 1823 by the anti-slavery activist Zachary Macaulay. In a pamphlet published that year, Macaulay asked the British public to take into account not simply the amount of our West Indian trade, but the amount of what it costs us to maintain it, and the amount of what we lose by the preference we give to them over other parts of the empire. The monopolistic privilege granted to Caribbean planters, according to Macaulay, cost British consumers an excess of £1.5 million annually, as they were forced to pay over and above the free market price of sugar. It was not just British consumers who found themselves at a loss. The colonial monopoly was now becoming a burden on the domestic manufacturers, those who owned and ran these sugar refineries here in Sugar House Island. The sugar refining industry in particular suffered extensively from the protective tariffs that were imposed on foreign sugar, obliging them to purchase the higher priced West Indian equivalent. This was increasing their production costs and hazarding the saleability of their refined sugar in the European markets. Sir William Clay, who became MP for Tower Hamlets in 1832, argued that sugar refiners within Britain were now overwhelmed with ruin from no other cause than being compelled to use only sugar which was produced in the British colonies. And so, as Macaulay stated, instead of being a source of wealth to Britain, the West Indian colonies were now a dead weight upon it, a source of enormous expense without any adequate return. The first pillar upholding the institution of slavery was slowly withering away. Notions of free trade were on the rise, and so were notions of free labour. The rise of laissez-faire in the early 19th century and the notion of free trade became firmly entwined with the abolitionist proposals for emancipation and calls for free labour to replace slave labour. According to the revolutionary economist Adam Smith, slavery was not only morally objectionable, but also economically defective. As with the calls to abolish the home market monopoly, abolitionists had been arguing for many years that emancipated slaves could produce tropical staples more efficiently and cheaper than slave labour.
One of the arguments that abolitionists make, some abolitionists make, is to do not really with enslaved people and the conditions in which they labour, but it's to do with British consumers and the price of sugar, essentially. And there's an argument amongst some abolitionists that free labour will produce sugar more abundantly and profitably than slave labour. And so that's one line that abolitionists take as an economic argument for abolition.
Central to these claims was the idea that a healthier and more natural relationship existed between free labour and wealth creation. Emancipated workers would be committed within the capitalist model to the individualistic desire for self-improvement and advancement in society. Within the parliamentary debates, Edward Stanley would expand upon these sentiments. The colonial secretary exclaimed, contrary to the common belief of the West India interest, that slaves were not destitute of that spring of ambition which belonged to other people. that they were desirous, like others, of rising in the world.
Slaveholders, of course, continue to argue that their institution is profitable and economically important to Britain, that these colonies are part and parcel, essentially, of the wider British imperial economy, and that they pay dividends to Britain. One of the arguments that abolitionists come back against that with is that they believe, based often on ideas that derive from Adam Smith's thinking, that free labour ought to be more profitable and productive than slave labour. So their argument is that these colonies, valuable British possessions, will be more productive British possessions with a free labour regime rather than a slave labour regime.
Here, Adam Smith's revolutionary ideology had significantly bolstered the anti-slavery campaign, with the colonies now becoming more of a burden on the metropole as opposed to its greatest source of wealth. Abolitionists were able to incorporate these capitalistic values within their argument. Tried and tested in the East Indies, free labour was simply more efficient and was likely to be the only way in which planters would be able to escape the economic sinkhole that they were in. Central also to this argument was the idea that slave labour was becoming more and more unstable and that free labour was a safer alternative. Planters disagreed with this, of course, but it would be increasingly difficult to challenge this proposition after the events which occurred in Jamaica over Christmas in 1831.
Yeah. I guess with the slave stand uprising and stuff, it would cost planters more than if they uprise and start burning down fields and burning down buildings and stuff like that. Now, a lot of these people were absentee owners, so they don't know what's going on the plantations themselves, and they would think that the overseers should control the people, so that they won't have any uprisings or anything, and they don't know the dire situations that's going on there. So, to the point of uprising, they have to know about the atrocities that were going on. Now, I like to liken it to what's going on now. You have CEOs and stuff, and I'm talking about here again, like of these corporations. They don't really understand what is going on at the store level. They just up there making decisions based on how much they could make, but they're not paying attention to the actual workers themselves. And trust me, I'm living it right now. So they're going to keep they keep cutting costs any way they can at the expense of the workers, kind of like they're cutting hours so that they can save money. And then they expect one worker to do three workers' jobs. Happens all the time. You know what I mean? And the managers are like the overseers. You know what I mean? Which to some degree doesn't work because a lot of the managers are passive aggressive. You know what I'm saying? They don't come directly to you and say, "Oh, you do this," unless, of course, their job gets in jeopardy. And I was thinking there to think, in some essence, just despite them making more money than we are, they're pretty much in the same boat as we are as far as how the CEOs and stuff deal with them, because they're just as expendable as we are. They'll get rid of them in a heartbeat like that. I've seen it. So, I could see the same thing happen with the absentee owners telling the overseers, "If you don't do it, I will take everything you have and you won't have a job and I will blackball you forever and ever. You'll never get another job and stuff." And those people have families to feed. No excuses. But that's just the way things work. And to a certain degree, it's working the same here. Even though there's laws and stuff stopping that, the workers here don't really have anybody looking out for them. So then, they have to do what they have to do, and a lot of us are doing what we have to do, and a lot of people are disgruntled. You understand what I'm saying? Thing. Let's get back to this here.
Christmas Day, 1831, many of the sugarcane fields across the island of Jamaica were empty.
The Maroons.
Over 60,000 enslaved workers had intentionally chosen this day, when a large majority of proprietors had travelled to the towns and cities to strike. Their demands, simply a working wage. Within a few days, however, this protest would evolve into a full-scale, violent insurrection.
The Christmas Rebellion, which took place in Jamaica at the end of 1831, was a protest against slavery by enslaved people, and it's a protest against the system by those people on their own terms. And essentially what happened is, in the western part of Jamaica, particularly the parish of St. James, large numbers of enslaved people, we're talking about thousands of people, refused to work. They put down their tools. In most instances, they left their home property, usually a sugar estate, but other properties are involved as well, and they refused to comply with their masters.
At the heart of what would be the largest rebellion in the West Indies since the revolution in Saint Domingue were a few key figures and communities. Firstly, and most importantly, were the missionary community. Now, these were made up of Baptist and Methodist preachers who came over from England to bring Christianity to the enslaved populations. Now, this group, as we'll later go on to find out, were almost solely blamed by the planters for instigating the Jamaican rebellion. Yet, despite the long distrust that existed between Anglican proprietors and the nonconformist missionary community, it was highly unlikely that any Baptist or Methodist preacher would openly prompt rebellious activity. It would go against what they were told and instructed to do by the London Missionary Society, and also it would put their own lives in serious danger. Yet whilst it may be true that missionaries came to the West Indian colonies with instructions to promote obedience, this did not prevent slaves from seeing within the doctrine of spiritual equality sanctions for political discontent, and missionaries were well aware of this.
Enslaved people in the rebellion also make use of the networks that are provided for them by the Baptist Mission Church. So one of the things that has happened in the early 19th century in Jamaica is that large numbers of nonconformist missionaries have arrived in the colonies with the aim and intention of converting enslaved people to Christianity. Many of them Methodists or Wesleyans, but large numbers of them also Baptists. And the leaders of the rebellion in 1831, which gets called the Baptist War, are many of them members of this Baptist Mission Church. Some of them are even leaders, deacons within that organisation. So they use that structure, which allows them access to enslaved congregations in different parts of the island, for example, or different parts of the parish, to organise the protest that they have planned.
It came as no surprise then that the leader of the rebellion was an enslaved Baptist preacher. His name, Samuel Sharp. Sharp may have been enslaved, but he was also literate and well-educated. He was a well-respected and well-spoken deacon in charge of a missionary chapel in Montego Bay. Inspired by the nonconformist missionaries who had travelled to the West Indies, Sharp was not blind to the inherent contradictions that existed within the horrific institution. Despite attempts by planters to use the Bible to support slavery, there was far more evidence within the Holy Book to suggest that it was an immoral practice.
Enslaved people, like the leader of this rebellion, Sam Sharp, we know, used some of the ideas that they derived from mission teaching to help to inform their own politics of anti-slavery. So they used some of the teachings of Baptist missionaries to help shape their thoughts and ideas about how the institution of slavery should be opposed. So, for example, the idea that no man can serve two masters is used as rhetoric by these enslaved people, putting to their own uses the ideas that come from this white missionary group.
You see, that this is the reason why they didn't want the slaves to be educated, because if they educated, they could use their own beliefs against them, or their own purported beliefs, their own interpretation of the Bible against them. And that's exactly what Mr. Sharp did here. You understand that this is the reason why whenever there's enslavement, they ban the language that the people speak. And if they have different languages, they mix them up so they wouldn't be able to communicate. No education, you understand what I'm saying? And then here comes these nonconformist missionaries who educated these people, you understand what I'm saying? So now they could understand how to fight against the people that's the masters and the plantation owners and stuff by using intellect. You know what I mean? Of course, with a little nudge from violent protests and stuff like that. But you know, what happened is they could say, "Oh, they're animals, they're vicious and stuff." But you know, even though they had to get their attention by gunning the fields and stuff, Mr. Sharp came in with the intellectual side of it and say, "Hey, listen, this is because now they're paying attention." Yeah, and this is why, like I said, they try to keep them ignorant. Let's keep going. You know, any kind of slave. And you can see the same thing for women too. You know, let them stay home, have babies and cook, but not fully understand how the system of things work. So they won't be able to survive on their own.
What originally was planned to be a peaceful strike soon turned into a bloody uprising. Missionaries such as William Knibb pleaded with the enslaved population to stop rioting, but at this point, it was far too late.
Yeah.
And understandably so. For many slaves, this was their one and only opportunity to escape the horrific institution. Between the 25th of December 1831 and the 4th of January 1832, up to 60,000 enslaved people across 300 estates on the island burnt down buildings and warehouses full of sugarcane.
One of the things that the enslaved rebels do, which we know from their actions, is focus their attention on property, and particularly on buildings, and on those parts of the estates that are especially associated with their exploitation. So, for instance, at the centre of every estate there is a mill for grinding the sugar cane, and then other buildings that are associated with processing that cane. This is the sugar that they spend all year farming in the fields and then hauling to the mill to be processed for the profit of their masters. And so they attack those parts of the estate, and those are really expensive pieces of machinery and pieces of real estate, and they cost a great deal when they're destroyed. So this is one of the things that happens in the rebellion, particularly using fire to attack those parts of the sugar estates.
The rebels had timed their action well, when many planters resided in the towns for Christmas. When the terrifying news had finally reached them, the island's militia, made up of planters, merchants, shopkeepers and other white colonists, attempted to repel the violent mob, but they were overwhelmingly outnumbered.
Some groups of enslaved people confront the white militia in the interior of St. James Parish, and there is a big fight between enslaved insurgents and the militia at one particular plantation called Montpellier. And this is how the rebellion begins. Essentially, it's a mass strike by the majority of the enslaved people that take part, but there's also these confrontations that take place between some groups of armed slaves and local white militiamen.
After numerous numerous failed attempts to resist the rebels, and desperate to avoid total anarchy and collapse, the colonial government called upon Sir Willoughby Cotton, the commanding officer of British forces in Jamaica, and a veteran of Wellington's campaigns in Spain and Belgium. Cotton arrived in northern Jamaica with 2 companies of the 84th Regiment and an arsenal ready for war. For many slaves, the arrival of the King's troops was enough of an indication that their dream was over and left them little choice but to return to work. For numerous rebels, however, they had reached the point of no return. They continued to pillage across estates on the island, damaging hundreds of thousands of pounds worth of property, crops and assets. It was upon these rebellious slaves that the most ferocious crackdown and backlash was directed.
So the rebellion is a really big and important event, but it's very quickly suppressed once British troops arrive in the district of Western Jamaica in January of 1832, and this leads to an end to that mass strike, and those troops with the militia then sweep into the countryside and begin to defeat and capture some of the more die-hard rebel leaders.
The rebellion caused over £1 million worth of damage
Man.
across 300 estates, close to 100 million in today's money. With damaged property, 14 white colonists dead, the island was now under martial law.
So it's an event that's very big, but it's also an event that ends fairly soon, and with immense cost to those enslaved people who took the decision to rebel. So we know that about 200 enslaved people were killed during the suppression of the rebellion, many of them killed in cold blood during the fighting or after the fighting, and that 300 or more were executed after really hastily convened courts martial after the rebellion. So more than 500 enslaved people lose their lives as a result of the rebellion, many of them in extremely grisly fashion. And although this is a rebellion that's taking place in the 1830s, many of the sorts of things that we associate with 18th century slave rebellions, including enslaved people who'd been executed having their heads placed on pikes as a warning to others, is a feature of the aftermath, the brutal aftermath to this uprising.
Sam Sharp was one of those condemned to death by rope. He was hung in Market Square, Montego Bay, on the 23rd of May, 1832. Yet even the execution of the rebellion leader did not quench all white planters' thirst for revenge. For many proprietors, capital punishment was in no way sufficient retribution for what had happened. Once initial fears were overcome and the immediate uncertainty of the uprising had passed, planters smelt blood. They relished the opportunities that the uprising had presented to settle old scores of missionaries and repress the enslaved population.
The first response of white slaveholders in the district of the rebellion is to vent their fury against enslaved people, and we see that with the mass killings that take place. But quite soon after, they turn their attention to the missionaries. They blame the missionaries for starting the rebellion. To the slaveholders, their view of the world is such that they can't bring themselves to believe that enslaved people were capable of organising such a large-scale event. And they decide that it must have been the nonconformist missionaries, the preachers, who put them up to it somehow. And they begin to attack mission churches. They destroy mission churches and chapels. They physically attack and abuse white missionaries. Some of them are forced to leave the island. So there's an organisation that begins to emerge in this aftermath that they call the Colonial Church Union, which is organised around the Anglican Church, and it's not a particularly Christian organisation, and in many respects, in fact, it's the opposite. It's an anti-Christian organisation that is venting this fury against non-conformist missionaries, but it goes under the flag of a colonial church union because it's really difficult for slaveholders to argue that they're against Christianity per se. What they argue is that it's the non-conformists, the Baptists and the Wesleyans that are the problem.
No. I have to speak on this here a little bit. Now, a lot of people, when I did the very first video about slavery, and then some people didn't like my commentary to it. Well, here's where we could kind of bridge a little gap and understand where people in the West Indies may have come from, thinking that the British don't this or the British is vicious and all of that. Exactly what they just said there. How after the rebellion in Jamaica, which that's what they did for rebellions in any part of the island, including the French or anybody else, they went about it with such brutality. Now the surviving people, the surviving slaves, they passed that brutality down to their generation, down to their generation, down to their generation. And when they pass it down, they're not saying the British government did it, or they're not saying the British rich people do it, they just say the British. So then that forms a sort of dissension between British people and Caribbean people. And nobody stopped to think that, most people are just ordinary working people who doesn't really know what's happening. Back then, especially, there was no internet. There was no, it was all, something would happen and the people won't find out about it for months later because of the communication barriers that was at the time. Now, we have to take into consideration that. So imagine generations and generations and generations of saying this group of people do this, but not taking into consideration the full scope of why it's happening, not understanding the economic part of it, not understanding the political part of it, not understanding that there's an upper echelon that's creating the situation. And I know some people hate it when I say that, but that's exactly what's happening there, because some of the same people would say to me that, well, the ordinary British people didn't want the slave trade. But if I was to say, rich people do that, well, you keep blaming rich people for everything, but then, as history shows, that's who is doing most of the atrocities and thing, to maintain this stream of income. So we have to start talking to each other to understand that we can't just blanket a group of people for doing something that the ones who speak the loudest are stating that everybody's for what they're doing. And I hope I'm making sense by saying that. So we have to start, as ordinary working day people, we have to understand each other and form some kind of a solidarity and stop allowing ourselves to be pitted against each other. Like, well, okay, and I'll draw an example for here. Well, all these, like I explained before, they have a thing called the EBT card, the food stamp card, where it's money that the government set aside to give people who are struggling to buy food. So look at all these black people on the EBT card, you know what I mean? And they're taking everything. But where I live, the most of the people I see coming in with EBT cards are white people. They aren't as much. But they point out the other group of people because they want to keep that separation, you know what I mean? Even though we all are working paycheck to paycheck every single day, struggling to make ends meet, just like everybody else, black, white, whatever, religion or anything, we all pretty much, 90% of us are doing that. They don't want us to see that. Because if we see that, what happened in Jamaica could happen. That's going to mess with their money. And I'm not saying there's no good rich people. That's not what I'm saying. But with the prices of food going up and all of that stuff, and wages are staying stagnant, and the cutting of the hours and stuff, people could barely survive. Who's making the money? I saw something where they said that I think it was under President Bush, rich people were 20% richer, or had 20% more than ordinary working people. I know it's like 200 and something percent more. Granted, it's but that's not even a long time for it to the disparaging distance between rich and poor. But I'm getting away from the point. The point is that back then, like ordinary people didn't have the means to communication like we do now. So there's no excuse for us to be at odds. The only excuse we have is that we're listening to everybody else telling us what it is, and people listen, man. People just listen to people who they think is smarter than them. And in this climate now, people think you're smarter than them if you have more money than them. And this is from me talking to a lot of people. The people they look up to is the people with the most money, not the people who bring the best logic. Let's get back to this here.
Just after it had grown dark, we heard the trampling of many feet and the sound of many voices approaching. I went to the window and saw by the light of the moon a large body of men at the gates, probably from 80 to 100. They forced me back with violence to the other side of the room, cursing me as a preaching villain.
But this means a great deal of antagonism and violence directed against white missionaries, who of course then go back to Britain and tell their stories. And that is an important part of the debate that leads up to the Abolition Bill in 1833, of missionaries going back to Britain. The most famous is a character called William Knibb, and telling true stories about the horrific scenes that they've witnessed in Jamaica. Now, some of those scenes are the torture and execution of enslaved people, but they also tell of their own experience of churchmen, men of God, being attacked and abused by white slaveholders in Jamaica. And this has a really strong effect on British public opinion. It's one of the things that really helps to turn that public opinion against the slaveholders.
See? Communication. And of course, too, is a lot of poor people go to church. So if their people are coming and saying, hey, this is happening, this is what's going on, people are going to become aware. Before that, they probably wasn't, because nobody's is there to tell them. Nobody who's experienced the thing to tell them. Granted, too, some people don't want to listen when you tell them that you experienced something. I have that issue all the time here. Like if I say I experienced some kind of a discrimination, they go, oh, you're exaggerating, you're always complaining. That have something to do with being, I'm going to just say brainwashed. Let's go here.
In these last months before the Emancipation Bill.
The testimonies of missionaries such as William Knibb highlighted the bloodthirsty nature and the pent-up frustration of those who formed the colonial church union. It was not a good look for the planter class, whose reputation, character and identity had already been questioned by those across the Atlantic for quite some time. In a sense, the West Indian planters had shot themselves in the foot. The rebellion, albeit a reminder of the instability in the colonies, could actually have served as sufficient enough evidence that the enslaved populations were not quite ready for emancipation. But the brutal backlash that followed the rebellion and the charred ruins of the former Baptist chapels made people in the metropole view the uprising in a very different light. The colonial church union was declared illegal by royal proclamation in 1832, and the second pillar upholding the institution of slavery, that being the image of the West Indian planter as a loyal and patriotic servant of the British Empire, was in tatters.
Oh, this is quite interesting so far. I'm gonna stop this here. You understand what I mean? So there's gonna be a third part coming up. Coming up to the ending of all of this here. Man, I hope this is been as interesting to me as it is to you. You understand what I'm gonna say? I'm gonna leave a link to the first one, most likely on this side here, so that you could go check it and watch all of them eventually. But to see where it starts and thing. Hope you guys are having a good day out there. Come back here for the third part of this. Y'all take care of each other, all right? Cool runnings.